Good morning. A lot of familiar faces. Thanks for coming out. I want to especially thank our sponsors. Quad Graphics is a great conference room that they let us use all the time, and Saratoga County also sponsored the event. I think Mr. Bolger is there. Mr. Bolger. And then we also have a representative from Kerry Warner's office. Nicole is here. Raise your hand. Lots of old government people are here, and we really appreciate their support. My job is to introduce Mark Brown, but before that, I just got to tell you a joke. Tell me if it's a good one or a bad one. 3 golf clubs walk into a bar. Bartender looks at the first one and says, "Oh, putter, what would you like?" The putter says, "Well, I'll take a scotch on the rocks." Okay. Looks at the next one, "Oh, pitching wedge, what would you like?" "Oh, I'll take the same, scotch on the rocks." Looks at the third one and says, "Driver, what would you like?" "I'm the driver." That is the cleanest joke and the only clean joke I know. I went through a lot of them thinking I could get away with them. But I want to introduce Mark. Mark's put together a lot over his career. He's the State Affairs, Vice President for State Affairs at the Consumer Energy Alliance. And I'll get into that in 1 second, but I will digress for 1 second. People, this topic today is so crucially important. I'm a partner of Shanker Russo and Clark, downtown Albany. I don't do a ton of lobbying, but my firm does. The climate action issues that are going on down in Albany right now are unbelievable in terms of the thought process that they have, in terms of where they want to be, how they want to get there. It is an unbelievable cluster of stuff that's just coming together. I was going to say nonsense, but it's just a cluster of information that's coming. All of a sudden a crazy idea pops out, and a crazy idea pops out. Some of these crazy ideas stick, and that's the worst thing, because they're uneducated in a lot of the things that are sticking. So this topic is not going away anytime soon, and the more you can participate in these forums, and the more you can participate in what's happening, especially down in Albany with our legislators, there's just a lot of information that's coming into them, and they're trying to create goals and standards that hopefully they're reachable, but we've got to do something, and I guess they're trying, but this topic couldn't be more timely. So Mark, he oversees Consumer Energy Alliance's activities in the Northeast. He's testified on energy policy matters before state and local government. He's led issue-focused grassroots campaigns at all levels, state, region, local, federal, as well as appearing on numerous panels throughout the United States discussing topics such as wholesale electricity market design, electric and natural gas reliability, natural gas pipeline expansion, net metering, and siting of renewable energy infrastructure projects. This is a very appropriate topic for what's happening in Saratoga County. Tori, I want to thank you also for doing that. So without any more conversation from me, Mr. Mark Brown.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'll give you just a brief spiel on Consumer Energy Alliance and who we are. So we are a nationwide association made up of both energy producers and consumers. We support all of the above energy environmental policies. We just want to make sure that those policies deliver affordable and reliable energy to families and businesses. We are farmers, truckers, construction workers, manufacturers, again, energy producers, natural gas companies, utilities, nuclear power. So we pretty much cover the entire section of America's economy. So with that, look forward to a very open discussion today. I think we're going to have a lot of fun, and we'll get started. So our first panel today, we have Rick Cummings, who is Vice President with Mulhern Gas Propane. We have Amanda Vitullo, who is a Senior Representative of Economic Development with National Grid. And we have Bill Overbaugh, who's the Executive Director of the New York Propane Gas Association. So thank you very much. Now, if you would, we'll do some, Bill, starting with you, just speak about who you are and what you do.
Sure, thank you, and good morning, everyone. So first I want to commend everyone for taking the time out of your day to be here. This is such an important discussion. The legislation that New York has passed is going to impact every aspect of our lives and our businesses. And we all need to do everything we can to become more educated about what's coming down from above, no matter which side of the argument you land on. So my organization is the New York Propane Gas Association. We represent about 125 propane dealers in New York State, all across the state. Small businesses typically that deliver propane to homes and businesses for heating, cooking, hot water, generators, variety of different uses. And happy to be here this morning with you all.
Hi everyone, good morning. I'm Amanda Vitullo. I say it's a choose your own adventure last name. So, hyphen, one way, other way, totally fine. So I'm with National Grid's New York Eastern Division. I'm the senior economic developer for them. So I work with many of you on helping to grow your businesses. I also work with incoming companies to help them identify where there is energy infrastructure and how we will get it to them. And looking forward to being part of this conversation today.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Rick Cummings. I'm the owner of Mulhern Gas Company, which is a 105-year-old energy company located in Hudson, New York, just south of Albany. I am also former president of the NYPGA, the New York Propane Gas Association. I'm currently the New York State Director for the National Propane Gas Association, as well as the National Chairman of our Government Affairs Committee in Washington. So happy to be here.
Great, thank you. So we'll get started with a propane question. So what is the propane industry's role in ensuring, affordable and reliable delivery of energy to New York's consumers, both families and businesses? And anybody can take that.
In a nutshell, in particular to the propane industry, we essentially provide the benefits of what a lot of people in more urban settings get from natural gas. We provide that to rural customers. We have the same kind of low carbon footprint, roughly, as natural gas. We have the advantage of being deliverable by truck, essentially, is our niche. Hence, customers that don't have natural gas available to them could still get a low carbon fuel delivered to them, and it's a very versatile fuel, from home heating to hot water to cooking to crop drying to emergency power generation. We cover that aspect of it. As a portable fuel, and something that we will be seeing, I think, as these plans continue to roll out, is a lot of times we're the stopgap. We're the go-to guys when there's a emergency. Think Superstorm Sandy, when Long Island was whacked and it was bad. Propane stood up, and we provided the electrical generation, the emergency heat, things like that. So I like to look at us as kind of a low carbon guy on the block that's extremely versatile, and also as a stopgap, as when other fuels break down or the infrastructure breaks down, we can be there to fill those gaps.
Bill, do you have anything to add to this?
No, Rick covered it very well. I've always said that propane is the fuel that starts when the natural gas mains end.
So there's a lot of talk about reliability and what's going to happen with further electrifying the heating and transportation sectors of New York's economy. How does the propane industry see your role in ensuring you guys provide backup power, fuel for backup power generators? If you continue to see a declining base of consumers both on the residential and consumers industrial side, how is that going to impact your business down the road in making sure that large manufacturers have supply for their backup resources?
Yeah, and I understand that there are several organizations here today who provide industrial services. One of the roles that propane has is as a mixing fuel for those industrial businesses. So very broad usage for our product. backup generators. There has been there's been a the state has passed a requirement, of course, that gas stations after Superstorm Sandy, gas stations have to have generator backups. Hospitals, of course, have to always have that power, and propane is the fuel that can supply a lot of that. It's also beneficial because propane doesn't go bad over time. So when you have a generator that you may run off gasoline or diesel, when that gasoline sits for an extended period of time, you won't be able to use it. But propane will last indefinitely in that scenario.
But what in seeing various bills that have been proposed in Albany, especially with what's most topical now is the banning of fossil fuels in new construction. And the jury's still out on what date that's going to happen, or I guess if it's going to happen. I think it's probably likely. But I've noticed in some of the bills there's a carve-out for electric generation. And here's going to be the issue going down the road for the propane industry. A lot of industries, a lot of homeowners depend on us for backup electrical generation. And I think the state has recognized that. What they haven't recognized is that the propane industry can't exist on that load alone. So if they are eliminating industrial and residential uses for propane, they're going to eliminate the propane industry. So those backup generators are going to be worthless because you can't viably run a delivery system based on sporadic outages. And of course, when there is an outage, everybody needs it at once. So the whole model breaks down. And frankly, to me, this is what happens when government starts monkeying around in markets. There's all kinds of unintended consequences that they're not foreseen in Albany and will be pain to consumers. And that's kind of the path we're heading down now, which is disturbing to me.
So you're saying it would be bad for hospitals not to have power in the middle of a snowstorm in January?
Yeah. And anybody that depends on propane is going to be, I think, woefully disappointed if they continue down this path, because we'll no longer be able to exist. And I've seen NYSERDA's charts on our industry, and it goes to zero eventually. So that's out there.
You guys are what, I think 27, 30%, somewhere around that for
as we like to say, we're a mile wide and an inch deep. We, as compared to natural gas and electricity, we're a small player, but we affect a lot of people. Almost, I mean, everybody in here with a gas grill all the way up. We're practically in almost every rural house in New York State, at some level. So. That's the downside risk of losing that. And if they think we could exist on barbecue cylinders, they're woefully mistaken.
One thing I should say is it's our intention to hold questions until after both panels. But if someone has an urgent question that they just can't wait, please raise your hand. I'll be sure to ask it.
And Mark, I think Rick hit on an important point: is the role that the free market has to play in this debate. We all live in a world that was developed because small business owners saw a need and started a company and fulfilled that need. Over time, of course, they grew bigger and bigger into larger companies, but what we're looking at right now is a plan that comes very strongly top-down, and the challenge is the scoping plan of the CLCPA was put together by the Climate Action Council, a group of incredibly smart people who are very focused on environmental issues. They didn't have a lot of depth of knowledge about the energy industry itself. And so therefore, when they put this plan together, I'm not saying that that the plan that they've laid out is all bad, but to bypass the free market economy and to come up with step-by-step processes, you need to be an expert in each one of those areas, and they simply weren't. And so the plan that was put together, as we read through it, Rick and I, as members of of an industry that fills those needs. We see so many holes in this plan, ideas that they want to roll out that are just not practically effective. And so if we're going to roll out a plan like this, it needs to be something that's going to work. And if you come at this from an environmental perspective, you roll out a plan that's not going to work, all that's going to lead to is public pushback, which is going to set us behind in our path to achieving a cleaner environment.
Thank you. All right, so now we're going to get Amanda involved here. The Climate Action Council, they put forth some pretty aggressive greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. I think it's 40% by 2030, 85% by 2050, and I think it's 100% zero emissions for electricity by, I know it's 2040. Can anybody hear me, by the way? 2050. So what is the natural gas industry doing to reduce emissions, and what technologies do you see as potential replacements for natural gas? Hydrogen, renewable natural gas, that sort of thing.
Sure. So we are doing annual system reinforcements, as well as using weatherization and electrification where it makes sense. We're also pursuing emerging technologies such as hydrogen. So we're doing a hydrogen blending demonstration project right now in the town of Hempstead. And we also have a National Grid Ventures and Partners arm, which is investing in large-scale renewables. So we're very involved with community solar, offshore wind, and also considering emerging technologies that may not be available right now, but could be in the next 10 to 20 years.
Right, so there's a lot of talk of the pairing of offshore wind with hydrogen through electrolysis. Is that something that you see as a means to reduce emissions on your system down the road? Yes, absolutely. I think that synergy is a direction that we're very interested in. Great. So the New York ISO issued a report raising concerns about future reliability. How does that jive with the Climate Action Council's recommendations? And given the ISO's report, what is the feasibility of attaining some of these policy goals? And we can start with you. Sure. So I think that those concerns are valid. They're definitely very valid, and we need to encourage policymakers to. We need to encourage policymakers to consider that as they are drafting their own policy. And the good news is that we are seeing some of that happen. So this week, the New York Assembly's One House budget included some language regarding reliability and availability of power in their All-Electric Buildings Act. So we applaud the Assembly for that. I don't know if Nicole's here right now. Yes, thank you. So, and we look forward to working with the Assembly on that. I think overall, we have weighed that in our own clean energy vision. And so we aim to be net zero by 2050, but our roadmap of how we get there is slightly different than what the CAC proposed. So it agrees with the CLCPA goals, but we think that maybe it's 75% electrification, and that's for a number of reasons. We want to preserve reliability for our customers right now. In storm events, power goes out, you want to maintain those alternatives. And then looking towards the future, how do we use our natural gas network, but with 100% fossil-free fuel? And that's also just so that we are retaining customer choice, so that they still have those options. So overall, we agree with the CLCPA plan, but we do feel as though reliability is a very important factor.
So the New York State government has already passed regulations requiring us to start to move toward all-electric vehicles. That'll begin as soon as 2030. You will no longer be allowed to buy a new vehicle that runs on fossil fuels. The All-Electric Buildings Act, which was up on the screen there, would require new construction to each building to be all electric. And then shortly after that, the plan is to require change-outs in people's homes to be all electric. So you add these things up and you're looking at about a 400% increase in electrical demand on our grid. Our grid that was built 40 and 50 years ago, which, as Mark had said, the New York ISO has said that there's chances of grid reliability concerns beginning as early as 2023. So my fear is, with a stroke of a pen, they can eliminate fossil fuels that are a good, solid, strong source of energy in New York State. But it takes significantly more than the stroke of a pen to quadruple the capacity of our grid. And so, again, I go back to that earlier statement that if this is going to be directed from the top down, then they need a lot more thought to put into how to set up our grid to be able to handle what they're going to be sending at it.
Right, and a little background. So right now the grid, electric generation, about 46% of it in New York is from natural gas. About 25% of it is from nuclear. I think another 10 to 15 is from hydro, and the other kind of 10% is from renewables. So it's going to be a pretty big push to try to meet some of those goals. And one other thing in the New York ISO, reliability report is they're looking at an increased peak demand. Right now, I think the peak is around 24,000 megawatts in New York. So they're looking at that as maybe 31,000 megawatts down the road, and it's going to convert to a winter peaking system because you're going to get more, heating sector load from electrification. So it's going to be a challenge, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens. What happens with that. On that note, you're going to have to site a lot more electric generation. Like you said, it may take 400 times what we currently have, which means installed capacity is going to go from roughly 30,000 megawatts to 120,000 megawatts. How difficult is it to site energy infrastructure in New York? And are there siting rules that favor one resource over another?
So I think everyone in this room has probably had experience with this in some way, shape, or form. It is difficult, I'd say, for both. I can't say that one is easier than the other. Obviously, from National Grid standpoint, we're not expanding our natural gas network. Policy has obviously influenced that. So that may, create an additional impediment. But Brian Sano, who's in the back, he's our new regional director, he said this yesterday, and it's true. I think the public sentiment about expanding a natural gas pipeline underneath your neighborhood is about the same as putting a substation in your backyard. So, both are contentious conversations. If any of you have ever been a part of getting energy infrastructure to your facility, then you know that it is riddled with nuances and roadblocks. There is land rights, there's easements, there's the same supply chain constraints that everyone else is experiencing, so time and money, environmental assessments. So building out electric infrastructure is certainly not an easy feat either.
Well, I could just add on behalf of the propane industry, we've never had an easy time citing storage in New York State. It's a classic NIMBY. Everybody wants to use propane, but nobody particularly wants any kind of storage of any meaningful size in their neighborhood. I will say in the short term, the uncertainty on all that we're discussing today has made it extremely difficult. A bad situation even worse as far as the propane infrastructure, and because the future for our industry right now is so uncertain, and that doesn't only apply to physical plants. We're finding that it's also the human capital side of the equation is difficult because it's hard to find people that want to do this kind of hard work in service technology and delivery, delivery drivers. But it's even more difficult with the uncertainty that now hangs over our industry. Nobody wants to get into an industry that's getting phased out. So we are in a critically difficult period as far as building propane infrastructure in the state.
And the NIMBYism isn't directed at any one resource or another, right? I mean, we've seen opposition to natural gas pipelines. The Champlain Hudson Power Express had its opposition. The offshore wind farms are certainly facing opposition. Electric transmission, utility scale solar is facing opposition in upstate Western New York. So it knows no bounds.
Absolutely.
Well, those are all my questions. Does anybody from the audience have any questions for any of our panelists?
Can you all leave us with a little glimmer of hope? A little positivity?
So I'll add that we are shifting a little bit in how we invest in our own system. So typically we've been, reactive. I think if any of you have ever tried to connect to our system, typically you'll tell us, okay, I need 50 megawatts. We'll do our study. We'll figure out how to get the power there. And we're looking now to be a little bit more proactive. So considering where there might be growing demand based on these clean energy goals and figuring out a way to get there just in time as opposed to too late. So we're shifting as a company to consider all of these things, and hopefully that gives you some hope. Utility is trying to be innovative.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that. So it might be helpful just to briefly revisit where we've been on this. So back in 2019 is when the CLCPA actually passed, kind of in the middle of the night. Nobody really had an inkling, or not a lot of people had an inkling of what that actually contained. That established the Climate Action Council, which took a year and a half, 2 years, to formulate a plan. Still, largely the public was unaware of what's going on. It's only been recently that the public is starting to get, and through things like this, that the public is starting to have any kind of level of awareness of what's coming down the pike. And there are meetings like this happening all over the state. Bill has been great on attending many of those. I've attended many of those. So I think at long last, we're starting to get public input into the process, and it's my sincere hope that we can, we're all looking for the same goal here. It's the path on how to get to that goal. And I think with some public input, we can find a way to get there that isn't such a top-down solution as currently proposed, but still gets us to where we want to be.
And I'd say similar. I'm actually really excited about what the future can hold for gas fuels and fossil fuels in general. So if you rewind 30 years ago, over the past 30 years, we have managed to reduce per house consumption. We've improved the efficiency per home by 20 to 30%. And I think that there's still a lot of opportunity for that. If you look at the upstate New York housing stock, I grew up in a house that was built in the 1850s. And there's so many older homes that have such opportunity for building envelope improvement, and then changing out old, inefficient appliances for modern, 95% efficient systems. And so when you look at what has been achieved already in the past 30 years, and fast forward that to the next 30 years, there's no reason not to believe that the fossil fuel industry is not going to invest in new technologies. From the supply side also, renewable natural gas, renewable propane, biodiesel, bioheat heating oil, these are all green, renewable products that are becoming increasingly available on the marketplace. And they're so amazing. Renewable propane is produced as a byproduct of generating synthetic gasoline or biodiesel itself. And so it comes from plants that are grown in America by American farmers, people who need more income to support to sustain their businesses. And what you're left with, we've all got experience with ethanol in our gasoline and the problems and challenges with ethanol. But that's because you're mixing a gaseous fuel or a fossil fuel with an alcohol. Renewable propane is molecularly absolutely identical to propane. And so when you run renewable propane in a system, it will behave exactly like regular propane. So there's so much opportunity in the future. And what we need to do as New Yorkers is make sure that our government doesn't have a single-minded focus on one solution, but rather opens up the doors to that creativity that, as Americans we're known for.
Well, I want to follow up on, oh, sorry.
I just wanted to say, I'm here from Assemblywoman Jerry Warner's office. My name is Nicole Clark. I'm her legislative director. And everything that you're saying, she's very aware of and supportive of. She's aware of the NICE report and the reliability issues and the fact that we're going to be looking at winter peak issues sooner rather than later. And she does have a bill out. It's for a low carbon fuel standard. She's really been pushing that hard. We had hoped to get it passed last year. We're now hoping to get it passed this year. As Bill had mentioned, the Climate Action Council has a lot of very smart people on there. There are a lot of advocates who have this sense that there must be no more burning of fossil fuels, and they're not really cognizant of the issue of, well, you know, with renewable fuels, we are also reducing the carbon footprint. And so that's something that we're really trying to work on. We feel like we need to, our office needs to educate a lot of the other assembly members, and we are welcoming your input and interaction because we really feel like that there's an educational process that needs to go on right now for the members of the assembly to understand that we need these alternative fuels, and this is going to bridge us towards electrification in the future, and it's going to help us remain, our system remain reliable. The second thing I'll mention briefly is the Assemblywoman also has a highway and depot charging plan bill that she's just come out with, and that is also dealing with the fact that infrastructure takes quite a while to build out. It takes, I think, I'm hearing 7 to 8 years, right, to get things going. And if people are buying their EVs, as they're going to need to be doing more and more, they expect to be able to charge them. And so to get the infrastructure for that electrification where it needs to be, we need to be planning now. And so she has a bill, and we are looking for help with this. We need your input. Just wanted to figure that.
Thank you very much.
And that's something that we're also evaluating from electrification of transportation. We're studying what it would take to expand transmission along the thruway in order to meet the need of increased electric vehicle charging. So we're also looking at that.
Great. Bill, I want to circle back with you on something you said about efficiency, especially of propane gas boilers. I think you said 95% or 96% or whatever they are. Keep in mind, as I said earlier, about half the generation in New York is right now currently produced from natural gas. And when it gets cold, a lot of those natural gas plants are what are called dual fuel plants. So they can run on either fuel oil or gas. But they're not as efficient as a natural gas furnace. So they may have a 50% efficiency, 60% efficiency. They're still highly efficient electric generators. Very low cost, especially when the fuel cost is low. But can you speak from maybe an emissions standpoint, what's more efficient, burning gas in your furnace or burning gas at an electric generating plant? Or oil at an electric generating plant?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Is there's of course an expectation that heating your homes with electricity is emission free, and frankly, that's not the case. It's dependent upon how that electric grid, how that electricity is generated on the grid. And here in New York, we have, I like to say it's a tale of two grids. So we have the downstate grid, which is quite a dirty grid. And then we have what we use here upstate, which has significant amount of hydro and nuclear power. And so part of this process that the Climate Action Council has recommended is going to have to involve changing the generation of that power to non-carbon based fuels. And it's certainly something Amanda can speak a lot more to than me, but yeah, that's an important component of what we look at.
Any more questions from the audience? Sir.
As far as hydrogen is concerned, how do you see that to become a fuel that is more predominant in electric generation or replacing natural gas as a fuel?
So I will say my expertise is about an inch deep on this. As I said, we're looking at blending right now as the immediate opportunity. I look to Brian and Patrick in the back. I don't know what our future plans beyond this demonstration project really are. I think we're testing it out right now. It is a new technology, so considering that. Sorry guys, don't we can put you on the spot.
The road ahead is still uncertain. We're trying to diversify all of the opportunities. To diversify the energy portfolio, so all of our eggs aren't in one electric basket, which is reduces a certain amount of risk that I don't think anybody wants to.
And I will add the hydrogen that we're using is green hydrogen, so I know there's this whole spectrum of colors, gray, pink, blue. Ours is green. We do have a carbon capture system. I can't say exactly what it is, but it is green hydrogen.
And if I could just add on a personal note, I'm fascinated by hydrogen. I really am. I think that it's something that we need to seriously look at in the future. I can tell you anecdotally only, I testified twice to the CAC, and I can say that it was my impression that hydrogen wasn't well received by the audience, which I thought was surprising. So there is, I guess I take away from that, there is some pushback, hard to believe, against hydrogen. But again, to my mind, it speaks of, kind of an overarching issue here is we're putting the cart before the horse. I mean, hydrogen may be great in 10 to 15 to 20 years, who knows? But to try to jump the gun here and say that we're going to have hydrogen and to solve some of these problems, I think is really getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that renewable natural gas is a potential opportunity that's available to us right now. We're very interested in that as a company, and I think this panel would agree it is an immediate opportunity.
Now, does New York allow for LDCs to incorporate RNG into their procurements right now?
Ooh, I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure.
Okay, just curious. We passed a bill in New Hampshire last session to allow for up to 5%.
Okay.
New York's
a bit behind when it comes to places like Vermont, Hawaii.
Yeah.
Great. If there are no other questions, then we can take a little break before the next panel. Thank you so much. Association. At the far end there, we have Mark Eagan. He's a CEO with Capital Region Chamber and Center for Economic Growth. So thank you so much for being here. Kevin, get started with you.
Sure. Kevin Brasser, I'm plant director here. Been here for 35 years now, a long time. Quad, if you're not sure what we do, we print magazine, catalog, retail pieces. We're known as a weekly printer. We do a lot of the weekly magazines that you see at the counters. So glad to have everybody here, and thank you for coming.
Good morning, everyone. Alana, Daly from the Northeast Gas Association. We're a regional trade association representing the natural gas industry in all of New England, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. So our members are National Grid, other utilities, pipeline companies, LNG companies, and associated industries. We also have a research and development arm, NISearch, which I just mentioned because there was a question about hydrogen earlier. The industry is very actively studying at what percentages we can blend hydrogen safely into our existing pipes. What would we need to do to upgrade infrastructure if that's necessary? So the work is ongoing, and that's something we're certainly focused on. And I look forward to the conversation.
Good morning, everybody. I think I know about half the people in the room, but those that I do not, I'm CEO of the Center for Economic Growth, which is our 8-county regional economic development organization. Really what CEG does is sort of focuses in sort of three primary areas. One, what we do to help grow our area businesses, in particular that CEG is sort of designated as our manufacturing extension partnership, which really what that means is we get government money to help manufacturers in our community help improve their productivity and ultimately their profitability. So if there's anyone in here that's interested in learning more, I'd be happy to be a resource. The other is to attract investments and jobs to our community. Really, and the way that we do that is on a regional basis in partnership with organizations like SEDC. So if we have leads that we say, okay, based on what their needs are within the 8 counties, what counties have sites that could work, then we would work with Tori and team from that side. And then the last piece is really how do we help prepare the region to compete in these spaces. And then sort of the dual role I have also is as CEO of the Capital Region Chamber. So we fall under the same umbrella. And really our missions are the same. It's how do we create vibrant, growing, prosperous communities. But how we execute it is different. So the public policy side of the house happens from the chamber versus the CEG side. So obviously today we'll get a chance to talk this morning how earlier on we tried to influence this process, and our hope is how you can help us influence it as we go forward. So thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. So now we'll get started on the questions. So look, we've all heard about high energy costs, and there's news reports and testimonials, and there's events like this that all talk about high energy costs and its direct impact on businesses and their operations. One of the things you don't hear about is the indirect costs, the costs on labor, taxes, things like that. So are there any examples of unintended consequences that have already occurred or that you foresee occurring from some of the proposals put forth by the Climate Action Council? What impact does businesses moving to more affordable states have on the areas left behind? And as far as tax-based infrastructure, emergency services, all that sort of thing. So I know it's an all-encompassing question, but Mark, let's get started with you.
I guess I would say yes to all the above. Steve Bolger and I were talking earlier and said, I said, Tim, I think one of the challenges here is if you look at the principles of what the long-term goals are, I think for most of it, it's hard to argue that those are aspirational goals that we should have as a state, and we should have as a nation, and then hopefully as a world. But really the question is, how do you get there? And how long does it take? And I think that unfortunately New York has determined they're going to be the leader in this space. Versus, and as you know, it's not always how fast you get there, but do you do it right? And we know that already, the list that we're on, we're the state that currently loses the most population of any state in the country. And if you look, and when people talk about what are the reasons for it, oftentimes it's cost of living, it's taxation, it's regulation. Well, then you take what we're talking about here, and how does that contribute to it? And I guess the other piece that I'd say, and we can probably get into this more, is I think the average person, whether it's in their business or in their house, still doesn't really understand what's going on. In the past year and a half, we contacted lots of employers and asked them to provide testimony through the process. And basically what they said was, well, that's what we want you to do on our behalf. Because again, to be frank in this room, we know how oftentimes things work in New York. And when you have the co-chair of the council being the head of DEC, if the company goes and speaks against this, well, then what will DEC maybe do to come in and do an audit and fines, whatever it might be? So I think it's now that process is closed. I'll jump into the comment that Nicole made earlier, and again, we can maybe get into it more a little bit later, but now that it's been done, how do we talk to our legislative delegation, and how do we get the message to other folks throughout the state? If all of our legislators understood this issue like Kerry Warner understands this issue, we wouldn't have an issue, but most don't. So I guess that's what would be my sort of opening comments.
Thank you. Alana, and I know you're a trade association, you have a a bunch of diverse members there, but any input here?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity. I think I would start by saying, as others have said, as an association, we are supportive of the goals, not just in New York. I mean, as I said, we represent the entire Northeast, and the states are almost pursuing some amount of carbon reduction, and they're on different time frames and they have different goals. But we support those efforts, and as I said, we're working to lower our carbon emissions. We think energy efficiency obviously is a great way to lower emissions, and it saves money, to your question about costs, because energy you don't use is dollars you've saved. But on this question, I think one thing that concerns me when I think about New York, and Mark made the point about kind of leading and going first, in terms of the economic impacts, I worry, because we're not doing this nationally, and we're not even doing it regionally, there's going to be economic leakage, I guess is a good term for it. And one example that always comes to mind for me that I think drives the point home is if we get to a point where we can't use fossil fuels in certain industries or in any industries, certain industries can't operate without them right now, or the costs become so prohibitive that they won't operate in New York. But they can move across state lines and, for example, to somewhere like Pennsylvania, and they can continue to serve the New York metropolitan region or the Northeast just as easily. We've done nothing for carbon emissions, but as a state and a county, we've lost jobs, we've lost the tax base, and I think you could see that happening in certain industries, and I don't need to tell anyone in this room, that fuel costs and fuel availability is extremely important to many industries. In terms of individual people, you asked about the indirect costs. I also think, as Mark said, people are already voting with their feet, that it's challenging to live in New York for a variety of reasons. Some of that obviously nothing to do with the economic or environmental policy, but this will, I think, has potential to compound the issue if we aren't careful.
Thank you. Kevin?
Looking at it a different view, our energy production is both, efficient and effective as we have currently, right? And there is a competitive advantage to being in Saratoga as a business. I mean, Quad wouldn't be here if we weren't, right? So I think it's just a matter of, us getting to our policymakers so they understand the same thing, that for an example, we have the second lowest energy costs of any large facility of Quad's network, and they're a very large network. So it makes sense for us to be here, and we want to continue to do that going forward. So we need New York to understand that competitive advantage that we have and to hold on to that in the future.
I guess a follow-up.
Mark, can I?
Oh, absolutely.
I just want to, it's probably worth noting that, or it's important to note that as part of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the CLCPA, that was passed in 2019, there are two off-ramps, they're called, to implementing the goals and the law. And one of them is cost. There's a recognition that cost can't get too high or this isn't worth it. The other one is reliability. So I think policymakers are aware that those are the two most important components, but how, if and when they decide to, use those off-ramps, that remains to be seen, but there are potentials there. So there is a recognition, I think, from policymakers that those are real concerns.
Kevin, from a plant manager perspective, are you concerned? Well, we have a large number of manufacturers as members throughout the country, and we've had conversations with them. And we've had conversations with manufacturers who aren't members, but have concerns about some of these policies. And one of the things we've heard is, the impact on the labor force. So, if families are forced to, convert homes, to heat pumps or gas appliances to electric, or electric vehicles, or whatever it may be, that the cost of labor may be too high or so high that it makes it less economic for operations, in New York. And these are some of these, for companies that really have alternatives, right, that can move shop to other locations. Are there any concerns there with you guys in that regard?
Well, there's always a concern, right? Financially, there's always a concern to stay in business. right now there's a concern of just getting people here that we have now in the state, right? Just our workforce that we have. We want to continue to grow, so it is always a concern for sure. We'll do whatever we can to make sure our employees are taken care of, and I'm sure there's a tipping point for any business as to where that stops, right? But just looking at the foreseeable future, we're moving forward and we're here. So,
Great. Mark, are you hearing anything from your members, about those types of concerns?
Well, yeah, I think it's. I don't think that the average employee understands it yet. Some of you in the room might be, my age, but I'm 58, and my comment I made to NYSERDA was, I remember as a kid, growing up in the 70s, that our country had a problem with litter and pollution, so if some of you might get my age or older, maybe remember that. And so what did the country do? They really tried to change public opinion. If you remember the Indian on the side of the road with the tear, or give a hoot, don't pollute. And I said that to NYSERDA, and I said, but I said, right now the average person, they still want to have a gas grill on their deck. They still want to have, a gas stove in their kitchen. And what are you going to do to change public opinion, and sort of that evolution? So that gets to the employee piece, because again, I don't think that they understand that component. And then to the affordability side, when I mentioned Carrie Warner earlier, she and I were talking about this maybe about a month ago, and she said to me, I wanted to get a sense. So she said, and I think it was Mark who said he had a house that was built like in the 1800s. I think Carrie's house was like built in the late 1800s, and it's a modest sized home. And she said, I checked, and she said it's going to cost between $20,000 and $30,000 to retrofit my house. And she said, if I look at my typical constituent, and she goes, and the legislature didn't pass an increase in their salary like they did mine. She came around and said that. She said, so I can afford to do it if I have to. But for so many of those people, it's elderly people in my community, and the equity that they've built in their home, they're now going to have to use it to upgrade the house to be able to sell their house or for their estate. Those pieces haven't gotten there yet. And then I guess to the earlier comment that, again, if you look at what makes a vibrant community. If you don't have jobs, you don't have a vibrant community. And ultimately, without adequate power, you can't have jobs. And if you look at the component of what we do to attract investment, no one's going to look at New York unless we figure out how you're going to do this. There's lots of things people look at when they look to bring jobs. But the very basic thing, the first thing is, do you have land and do you have utility? That's the very first thing. So we're right at the beginning of the list, we'd fall off the list. So there's a lot of issues, and I think going back to my earlier comment about why it's important now to talk to legislators, is they can really be the stopgap. So you have the recommendations from the whole scoping plan and all of this, but it's to what degree do the legislators want to put their the pedal to the metal, or do they say there's this in concept this makes a lot of sense, but in reality there's lots of unforeseen consequences, and that list is very, very long. So again, that's why I think it's real important now. If you weren't concerned about expressing your opinion to NYSERDA or DEC, okay, I can understand that. But there's no reason that you can't now do it with your legislators. And if you need help in crafting what the message is, you have my contact info. We can give you what those main talking points should be.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Just as a kind of a follow-up, Walden Hub put out some data, I think it was in December. 60% of Americans right now don't have $500 in their savings account. roughly the same number can't afford a $1,000 emergency, which means that, you know, they don't have access to credit to be able to cover, you know, an emergency cost. So most people aren't in a position to be able to retrofit, you know, their homes, apartments, you know, whatever it may be. And another interesting thing is, back in the fall, the state of Maine, and I don't know who did the poll, but there was a poll in the state of Maine, and they basically asked people, you know, do you think government should tell you what type of appliances you should have in your home? 9 out of 10 respondents said no. So that gives you an idea of where the public is on the issue. Now, you know, Maine's a purple, leaning blue state. You know, it's not Arkansas. So, you know, high percentage of independent voters there. You know, they don't want government telling them what kind of appliances they can have in their homes. So, again, speaking to your point about folks not really understanding what's going on, I think that illustrates that. Thank you very much for those answers. Going back to the Climate Action Council, so it's my understanding they made a lot of recommendations, but there wasn't really any kind of thorough cost-benefit analysis. I know there were some comments made, you know, cost of inaction is more than the cost of action and that sort of thing. I guess the question is there a reason why they didn't do a cost-benefit analysis? Anyone want to touch that?
Go on, you start.
So I get to be fair, there was a cost-benefit analysis, and it does show that the benefits were positive. I think about $400 million to the positive side. I think one of the things, to your point about a thorough cost-benefit analysis, or kind of the underlying assumptions that can be concerning about that analysis, is that some of the things that it counts as benefits are not just going to be borne by New Yorkers. If we don't get all of the benefit, an example is clean air. Anywhere downwind of New York, if New York's air is cleaner, they get that benefit. Pennsylvania gets that benefit, New Jersey, Connecticut. But our residents are going to bear all the cost. So that's one example. Another example is one of the benefits was a move from personal transportation to what they refer to as active transportation. What that means is you ride a bike more and you walk more than you use your personal car. And that's great in a metropolitan area where there's good public transportation, but New York is a very big state with diverse economies. So, you know, that's not going to work in Western New York the way it works in Manhattan. So I think there's concern that it's not, as you said, that it's not thorough enough. I also would say, the scoping plan, and I think it's linked there, you could read it. I would say it's not a roadmap. It's not an exact science, obviously, because no one can predict the future about how we're going to achieve these goals. So I think what we need to do going forward is, as we implement pieces of the scoping plan, we need to be doing cost-benefit analysis as we go, so we understand these total costs. And I do think that the council kind of, you know, committed to that. But then we have to remember, the cost for one item or one piece of the plan, you need to remember the total costs. And right now, you know, those costs are borne by each of us through surcharges on your utility bill. So somewhere probably between 15 to 22% of your utility bill is surcharges and taxes. That's going to necessarily increase as we make these investments, or we need to find other sources to pay for those. Obviously, I'm sure everyone's heard about potential for a cap and invest program that's being talked about in Albany. Other sources would be federal funding, but at the end of the day, the money all comes from consumers. So.
Thank
you. We talked about it earlier, that there's lots of good elements of the plan, and we've asked numerous times about cost. And numerous times we don't get an answer. And so I think that, again, this goes a little bit to sort of the public policy side. Most people would say that it's not sound public policy to implement something when you don't know what the cost of it is. And again, the cost is ultimately to New Yorkers and what the impact will be on their standard of living and their quality of life. And again, I want to go back to the piece and say, we're not saying not to do this, but the issue is, what's the evolution of it? And if you haven't looked, there's a lot of goals they have that are in 2030. And, you know, we know how quickly time goes by. You know, I feel like, you know, my daughter was born not that long ago, and 2 days ago she turned 21. So we know that 2030 is right around the corner. If you don't know those costs, and we don't know really what the ramifications are going to be to people's households and to the economic stability and growth of New York, why would we implement at this time?
And could I just add, I think there's some examples we could look to for economies that have kind of gone ahead of us or a little bit ahead of us. California would be one, they have extremely high energy costs, but also Germany. So post Fukushima, Germany decided to shut down all their nuclear power plants over a period of time and really invest in wind and solar. They've spent $500 billion on the effort. They have some of the highest energy costs in the world. They're driving away their manufacturing base, which has been, you know, a jewel for that economy for decades. And because of, not just because of, but the war in Ukraine obviously didn't help, and their inability to get Russian gas, they burn more coal now than they did before. And to what end? I mean, that doesn't improve carbon emissions. I mean, I think we have to be smart about balancing reliability and affordability, and there are low carbon fuels that we can do this. With an all of the above approach, we can get a long way there, but we need to be cognizant of the cost.
Yeah, I think Germany's reduced their fossil fuel consumption by, I think it's 7%, their electric generation from fossil fuels by 7% over 10 years at a $500 billion price tag, I think it is. So it's pretty substantial emissions reductions. So we're going to get a little nerdy here. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation that's the entity that is authorized under the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It's responsible for reliability of all of North America's electricity grids. That includes, you know, the United States and Canada. They've issued increased levels of warnings about reliability, not only in the Northeast, but in the Midwest. Some levels are higher than others, you know. But one of the reasons why is because, you know, reserve margins, which is those reserve margins of capacity that are supposed to supply the grid, you know, additional power when, you know, a resource fails. So if a substation goes down, an electric transmission line goes down, these are your generators in reserve that are able to, you know, fire up and provide power in those types of situations. But what's happening is, because of the changing resource mix, and a lot of the new resources coming online are wind and solar, and they are intermittent or variable, or however you want to look at it, it's kind of changed, you know, the idea of, you know, the strength of reserve margins now. So I guess, you know, they don't mean what they did 10 or 20 years ago. I live in New Hampshire, you know, we're under the ISO New England. They've warned that, you know, our reserve margins are going to have to increase by 300 to 400% as we transition. So I guess the question is, you know, when it comes to cost, it looks like we're almost going to need two grids. You know, one of them, you know, variable renewables, and others that are, you know, either baseload nuclear or dispatchable, you know, gas and other fuels. Who'd like to go first?
I guess I'll get started. Yeah, no doubt. With intermittent resources, I think a common misconception is that when we add solar or wind to the grid, which is great when it's producing, but it doesn't always produce. So you don't actually displace resources. You're not shutting down any natural gas plants or other plants, because we have an expectation in the state and in this country that when you flip the light switch on, the lights go on all the time. And that's what that reserve margin that you're referring to allows for. So I think right now, the NISO in New York, our grid operator, has about a 19% reserve margin. That's going to have to increase substantially, as you said. I think what's going to happen, you called it two grids. I think what we're going to end up doing is we're going to be paying for, or we're going to need the grid we want, which is like the public policy desire for wind, solar, and lowest carbon resources, but also the one we need, the one that maintains reliability. And that's right now in the state, that's natural gas, and we have nuclear. Not the issue with nuclear. Nuclear is just, it's always the same. It just runs the same amount unless it's down for maintenance. So natural gas and other fuels like oil allow you to ramp quickly. You can't ramp a nuclear plant the way you can, and you can't call upon intermittent resources. They also aren't coincident with peak. So I live a little bit downstate from here in Dutchess County. I think our peak is somewhere around 7 p.m. Well, solar peaks at 2 p.m. Or thereabouts, depending on the time of year. So all that whole night, you've got to keep the lights on, right? I think battery storage is certainly a big opportunity, but at this point, with current technology, battery power is a 4-hour resource. So you still need another resource. So I guess your point being is we're going to be paying for a lot of resources in order to keep the lights on. And you've got to, if you want those natural gas plants to stay online, they're going to have to be paid some amount of money even when they're not running, so that they're available and they're maintained and that you can turn them on quickly. I think what the ISO, they've raised concerns about this last year. I think they released a report in last summer with their long-term concerns about reliability. Not today, but their longer-term concerns about reliability. And they basically said, there's a resource we need that has to be dispatchable and fast ramping and zero emissions if we're going to reach our public policy goals. But that resource doesn't exist yet. So there's a lot of innovation that has to happen, and I think someone said on the earlier panel, I'm confident in this country we can do it. We've met challenges before, but as somebody else said, you can't put the cart before the horse. We need to invest in research and development. We need to make big strides, but in the meantime, we can't, we've got to be cognizant of what we're capable of today and what people are willing to pay for.
And that's just going to get exacerbated as you go to a winter peaked grid, because if you're peaking at 5 p.m. In January, you're not getting a lot from solar panels in New York.
Well, that's right. I think solar is about a 12% capacity factor, which means it's over the course of an entire year, it's operating like 12% of the time. So you also have to build a lot of it, because a nameplate of a solar facility, if its nameplate is 1 megawatt, compared to that, or if its nameplate was like 6 megawatts, you would need like 1 megawatt of a natural gas plant for that kind of to meet that kind of power, because natural gas, aside from maintenance and whatnot, has a capacity factor of it's in the 80s, and nuclear has a nearly 100% capacity factor. So all of these, it's all very complicated. It's very interesting. These are really exciting times, but this is all very complicated, and the electric industry invented just-in-time delivery, right? The electricity you create is used right away, and you have to do that all the time, every day. And it seems like magic almost, because of how easy the industry has made it for us, that the lights do always come on. But it's highly complicated, and it's not as easy as it looks, I guess.
And we get really mad when they don't. Mark, having any? I know Alana.
She did a great job.
Covered it. So. All right. So for Mark, what demographics do you foresee being economically impacted the most, by some of these policy proposals, and what other negative impacts do you see?
I guess I'll start at the sort of the macro side, that there really isn't, from an economic perspective, there really isn't a sector of our economy that's not going to be impacted. But I think maybe more to your specific question, and you really alluded to the answer before. You look at, look at stories yesterday, today, where they talk about the Fed making another adjustment, and they talk about the average person and what they have in credit card debt and how much more it's going to cost them. That most folks in our community don't have a lot of savings. So what's this going to, and then again, sort of, if we talk about the unintended consequences of these components, So will it mean some of these people will, you know, and I don't mean to be dramatic, but you don't know the ripple effect. If they're already that much on the margin, you know, these people who are driving to work, they get a flat tire, they can't make it to the job because they can't afford to fix the tire. These folks who many of you employ in your companies, you know, what's the piece that all of a sudden puts them onto public assistance, which then again increase the costs from that side. So again, from the economic side, it's going to impact everyone. But the issue is who can absorb it and who can't. But the bigger piece isn't what the cost is. The bigger piece is, will you be able to operate in the state? And you mentioned it earlier about the component. Will someone just go to another state and still service us? That's really the lost cost for our state. If we think that we're losing population now, if we're looking for a way to accelerate it, maybe they found it.
Mark, have you seen any examples of, you know, a company leaving, you know, and I guess the deleterious impact, you know, to that locality, municipality, or whatever, you know, after it leaves for another, you know, another state or closes shop? I mean,
Yeah, well, I think all of us can think about it. You look at almost every, definitely in every county in our region, but almost even in every little city, town, or village, that if you know, how many brownfields do we drive by? You know, that manufacturer that stopped operating in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s that's still sitting there. And so you look at what's the lost tax revenue, the lost payroll revenue, you know, because of that. So I think it's really easy for us to see, you know, again, one of the responsibilities of an organization like ours is always trying to look around the corner. So if you look at it right now, from almost any indicator, our region is doing really well economically. But because we're doing well today, doesn't mean that we're going to do well 20 years from now. So again, go back to my earlier example. You know, if any of you are originally from or have, you know, family that maybe were from the southern tier, and you look at those communities, you know, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and what those communities were like and what they're like today, and how prosperity has passed them by. So those are all examples that all of a sudden when industries leave, goes back, remember my earlier comment? The only way you have a vibrant, prosperous community is you have jobs. There's a direct correlation.
You know, we've seen that in New England with paper mill communities. Mm-hmm. You know, where the paper mills have closed shop, and those communities still haven't recovered from, you know, those plants closing 20 years ago. So Kevin, as a large manufacturer in the city, how are you thinking about the impacts of this shift on your business as well as a community?
Again, you know, we touched on it with the employment issue. You know, Quad was founded as creating a better way for our employees, our clients, and our communities, right? So the quality of life in Saratoga is such that you really can't beat it. You know, the plant was built with ensuring that we'd have a workforce that continues the betterment of not only Quad's network, but the community. So, you know, I guess I'm trying to be the optimist here, but, you know, we're going to continue on that same focus. You know, we'll work with our utilities and get to where we need to be. And, you know, there's a lot of other things that go into play when you look at a business just up and moving, right? You know, there's the distribution costs, the postage costs. That's one of our biggest costs as far as Quad's client base. So there's a lot of reason to stay here, and you know, we're going to do whatever we can, and so that's our focus, is just, you know, staying within the community, doing what we can to help the community.
Great. And on those lines, can you talk a little bit about you know, the competitive advantages for employers in New York, given the state's focus on energy efficiency and you know, and renewables?
You know, so I would say, you know, with our partners in the utility, the SEDC, you know, we look forward to continuing to work hard to meet those customer needs and our employees' needs along with that. You know, as technologies emerge, you know, we'll look to see what best ways we can incorporate those. So, you know, in the most cost-effective manner. So.
Great. So before we get to questions, we covered a lot of ground here, but is there anything any of you would like to, add to before we get to questions?
I guess I'm just going to reiterate really the earlier comment about what do people know and how can they try to influence. So what I would just encourage each of you is to let people know a little bit what you learned today. So whether it's people in your house, people in your neighborhood, people in your greater family, your employees, because all of a sudden the more that New Yorkers are aware, and again, a lot of New Yorkers who really believe in what the goals are, but it's it's how do you go about implementing. So so if you came today to learn more, I hope that you did. We're not trying to be like Chicken Little with our head cut off, but we're the piece that, again, we have to look around the corner, and we have to make sure that we don't implement public policies that really have a lot of these unintended consequences or really put our region and the state at a competitive disadvantage.
Great. And just to follow up on that, Consumer Energy Alliance, we do support all of the above. We have members developing offshore wind, solar, involved in renewable natural gas, hydrogen. So, we just want to make sure that there's balance, that we are making sure that energy is affordable for families and businesses, and that the grid is reliable. So I don't want there to be a misunderstanding here that this is some kind of, a little bit pushing back or maybe anti-renewable. That's not what we're doing. We're just trying to point out that there are limitations, and we do need to make sure that we're moving forward thoughtfully, with whatever transition that we're moving forward with. With that, questions? Sir.
So how do you put a cost on something that we don't even know what is going to be in 7 years? To Mark's point, 7 years is going to come by pretty quick. We're in an industry that is limited on its reimbursements. But how do you plan for something you don't even know what you're planning for? You don't know what the resources are going to be available. We've got backup generators that we have to run, and if we're not going to use fossil fuel, what is that fuel source that's going to run that? And what's it going to cost us to get it there? And how do we go to our board and our leadership to ask for money, and they're going to ask what's it for, and we don't have an answer? How do we plan for that?
Well, there's probably no bigger chill on investment than uncertainty, right? And there's a lot of uncertainty right now when it comes to, the regulatory sector, siting of natural gas pipelines, siting of any energy infrastructure, to be honest with you. Any of you guys want to take a stab at that?
Well, I think in the earlier panel, Amanda touched on it, and that really, I think you're putting a spotlight on it. A lot of these are emerging technologies, so the answer is you don't know. And quite frankly, that's probably part of the reason why that they couldn't put a real cost figure on, because it's hard to be able to tell. So again, that's the issue of the old expression: do you crawl before you walk, and do you walk before you run? And because I don't think it. Let's put it this way: if you're manufacturing, you have plants in multiple states, and you have this big question mark out here, would it be more challenging to put forward a case that you should do more expansion in New York? It'd probably be hard to say that right now because there's that big question mark there.
I'm sorry, I don't know who was next, but
Go ahead, Andrew.
Anyway, we represent hospital systems, so we're not going to pick up and move. We just can't do that. So we have to make do with what we have. Not the grandstand or anything, but to your point about the education factor, is anybody spearheading like the commercials and the such like you had talked about for the? We're not in that position to be able to do that, but is there an organization that might be looking ahead for that?
I don't know if you know. I'm not aware, directly. Again, from my perspective, I would think it might fall under the purview of NYSERDA. But I don't. When I brought that point up, they didn't say like. They just sort of looked at me and nodded. They're like, "Yeah, we remember those commercials." It was basically the response. But are they going to actually do something? I don't know. Have you heard anything?
So, just so I understand the question, do you mean
Sort of public awareness?
public awareness? Yeah.
And I think change maybe consumers' opinions, right?
Yeah, I don't know that we've seen enough from the state. I think to your point, it probably is in NYSERDA's purview to educate New Yorkers about what's going on. I know there are some organizations like Consumer Energy Alliance who is doing what they can, like an example is today. There's a group, New Yorkers for Affordable Energy. I know they've done some educational pieces on this. I sometimes see their editorials in Daily News, New York Post, those kinds of organizations trying to raise awareness about what's going on. But I think it was said earlier, there was opportunity for public comment, but I don't know how many people really knew that there were opportunities for public comment when the draft scoping plan was being considered before the final scoping plan was released. So I think there's a big uphill battle to here, and I think it's incumbent on all of us, chamber organizations, economic development corporations, to raise awareness.
Yeah, we did a report on, essentially, retrofitting homes, and that's where that $30,000 number, came out. That report was passed all through the assembly, and so we got a lot of press out of that. We've testified before the Climate Action Council. We've provided written testimony, op-eds. So we've been out there trying to raise awareness on this issue.
What I meant was just like out in the public though, because in your chambers, wherever you're bringing it, the public just doesn't get it. I mean, it's going to impact them in the pocket. I mean, clearly that's what it's out.
Right. We like to hope our op-eds get read. But look, you're talking about hospitals, and that's another great example of indirect impacts, right? Because if your energy costs go up, or you have reliability issues, that's going to increase the cost of healthcare, which is going to increase the cost of health insurance, which is going to have another impact on employers. So again, there's a whole host of unintended consequences that a lot of legislators, policymakers, stakeholders, they don't think about that. They only think about this is what we want, and we don't really care about the impacts.
Mark? Just along the lines of the message that's gone out, that as far as I can see from the state itself, most notably NYSERDA, is they have a social media push to push electric heat pumps as a heat source. And all the communications I've seen from NYSERDA in this process are basically to support this legislation. It's not this venue where you talk about the pros and cons.
I still remember the days of CEN, which was Chief Executive Network in my company, Central for Electricity, which was part of it. And one of the conversations we always had was energy and finding employees. I mean, if you go into any company that is between 5 employees and 200 employees, Tom Marisek and downward, the topics have been the same for the past 10 years. And that network was always active, and so I haven't seen disappear.
Yes, we'll talk afterward, though. We have a reincarnated version.
All right.
Sir.
Has anybody looked at the effect on the housing market, affordable housing, people live in New York State, working in New York State, and what effect this will all have on that? Not just single family, but multi-family homes, that cost that much more to build.
So I don't have any data, but I think if the input costs go up, housing is going to become more expensive. I did see statistics recently. The Wall Street Journal did a report about, and this was across the country, homes with natural gas are more desirable and get a higher selling price than homes without it. So it's things like natural gas and propane are still very desirable resources for folks. So I'm, as much as we're pushing heat pumps, I'm not sure that everyone wants it. I think there's also challenges with heat pumps that we'll probably see over the coming years. A house in Rockland County, it's probably going to works very well. It's highly efficient, it's a tight envelope, newer home. Heat pumps are going to work great. Western New York, somebody said their house was from 1850s. Mine's 1900. I consider that pretty old. It's drafty. I'd be better served, I think, on energy efficiency than trying to put in heat pumps and keeping the house warm that way. I think we'll also see challenges with high rises, in the city, having the heat pumps. How much investment will it take to electrify those types of facilities? And remember, during the Bloomberg administration, there was a big push to move multifamily homes and buildings in New York City from oil, from the dirtiest fuels, to natural gas. And there were significant carbon reductions from that. So in fairly recent history, when you think about investment timelines, many of these building owners have made significant investments in their properties, and probably the useful life of that equipment has not expired yet. So, and now to, go further with it, that's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, and following up on that emissions statement, between 2005 and 2019, pretty sure the U.S. led the world in CO2 emissions reductions. Most of that was due to fuel switching, using natural gas instead of oil and coal for electric generation. So just, something to think about.
Hey Mark, there's a proposal in the CLCPA right now that would require every home, when it's sold, to be given an Energy Star rating. So homes that are not as efficient, high energy users are going to lose that.
So out of some of the technologies you guys are talking about, are any of them either market ready, so I can make an investment in it and it makes sense and I start getting payback right away, or it's a very short payback period? I think of LEDs. I was talking to these guys, LEDs 10 years ago, it didn't seem to make a lot of sense to do it, but in the past 10 years, LEDs are a really good way to save money, and the payback is pretty quick. The technologies that go into heating a house or a building, is there anything that's close to making sense?
I'll take first stab at it and I'll let you go. I think RNG maybe might be the closest. And there's two reasons for that. Anaerobic digestion, it cleans up water streams, right? It cleans up wastewater. It reduces those costs on municipalities or if there's private water systems. So there's a benefit there on the upfront. But byproduct of that is you create biogas, which can be used to either combine heat power, right? So it can either electrify the facility, you can distribute that gas directly on a local distribution system. So I'm not sure it's quite there yet, but I think of the technologies we've talked about, it's probably the closest to being viable and producing a return, and in some cases and in certain areas of the country it probably is cost effective. That's just my opinion.
I would say, maybe to your point, there's a recognition that some of these resources are more expensive than traditional, than what maybe would your default be for home heating and things like that. And so I'll put in a plug for my friends at the utilities like National Grid and the work that Amanda does. There are significant incentives available to residents and businesses for switching to heat pumps from, say, natural gas or oil or propane. So, for an individual business, that's that might be worth looking into. Obviously, I can't know your business and what makes sense, but there are incentives available, and also outside of the utility space, there are incentives and tax credits for things like solar installations on your property, and there is credits on your bill if you generate more with solar panels than you use. So there are opportunities. I think you have to be savvy. I think that's a challenge for large businesses. Like I said, I'm from Dutchess County, so IBM, Global Foundries, those are some of our big employers. They have somebody on their staff who's focused on energy all day. What's harder is for smaller businesses that can't hire someone to focus on that issue all the time and make those investments. So I would say, your utility is a resource for sure, and there are incentives available to try to bring down some of those costs.
I would counter with that too, that being a larger employer here, We work with our utilities. We just went through and qualified for a 50,000 ready program last year. And, utilities have worked with us to figure out what's our best ways to save on energy, what incentives are out there. So there's programs out there that can be utilized currently, if you haven't, right, as far as businesses go. We have many heat pumps here, but we also utilize a lot of natural gas and a lot of electricity. So.
I had a question earlier about the current input from solar and what that addition to the grid is now and what that might look like in 20 years, and is that reliable?
So I think you talk about net metering, like distributed
net metering,
solar.
Yeah.
I
We're
think
seeing a lot of solar position or projects coming through the IDAs and positioning, so they're just kind of getting a better idea of what that means and looks like.
right. So I think New York has about 3,000 megawatts of behind the meter, distributed generation is what it's called right now, and I'm sure nearly all of that's got to be solar. What happens with solar, it's called net metering. So as Alana said, what you don't consume, you export to the grid and you get paid. And I have to admit, I don't know what the rate is. I'm sure it's close to retail in New York. You get paid the retail rate, and that's great for you as a homeowner or a business that has done that. There's a lot of questions about cost shifting with the net metering program, right? Because utilities have to purchase that power at above market rates. Their shareholders certainly aren't going to cover the cost of that, so it's got to be paid for by someone else. Those are usually people who aren't adopting solar. And there's questions about increased distribution costs and a whole lot of other nerdy things that I'd be happy to talk about anybody offline. But I think as part of the incentives in New York, I think they want to double that number by 2030 or 2035 to about 6,000 megawatts. So it is, as Alana said earlier, solar has a capacity factor of about 12%, which means it operates 12%. Over the course of a year, it's going to run 12% of the time. So it's probably not something that's reliable. It's low cost, right? It can have some benefits because there's no fuel cost. And when oil or natural gas prices are high, there's definitely a benefit there. But again, there has to be a balance. We need to make sure that we have the resources to support the grid and to support consumers who can't afford, those 60% of folks that don't have $500 aren't putting rooftop solar on their homes. So we need to make sure that they're getting affordable and reliable energy.
I can tell you a little bit to that from a residential perspective. My wife and I installed panels about 5 years ago. We generate more electricity than we consume with the panels, and the buyback from the grid, I think right now is 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's well below market price. Now I don't know what it is for a commercial installation, but that's where we are on the residential side as well.
So on the residential side in New York,
4 cents a kilowatt
you're
hour.
getting the wholesale price for exports?
Yeah. Through the net metering, which is fine. We didn't put the panels in to sell the energy back, and the state limits the size on the system you can put in because of that.
Right.
And I think with regards to solar, the other thing that we're not talking about, and it hasn't come up at all today, China owns that market. When you install those panels, 95% of those are made in China. So all of these rebates and these credits that we talk about, that money's all going back to China.
Yeah, we can probably have a whole other panel on geopolitics of energy. And I'm happy to do that sometime. If you guys want to do that.
Do we want to invite the other panelists back up in case there's any questions or anything you want to do?
I think, do we have any other questions for the current panelists or the previous panel?
I had one for Rick, if I could. You commented earlier about, I think you referenced some hesitation with the public sentiment around hydrogen, I think, at a meeting you were at. Could you speak a little bit more to that, and do you have a feel for what's driving that hesitation?
I don't know. The short answer to the last part is I can't imagine what's driving it. What I was describing was my experience during testimony to the Climate Action Council, that certainly the audience, and to a large degree my impression was the Climate Action Council wasn't as interested as perhaps I was in hydrogen, in renewable natural gas, in renewable propane, and especially in nuclear. All of which seem like are extremely viable options, especially nuclear. I mean, and they all seem to be bad for them, but they were vilified just as much as us poor fossil fuel guys that were at the meeting, and they seem to have the same vitriol for these really clean sources of energy. I just found that very surprising. I can't give you a logical answer on why.
And it's disappointing because hydrogen absolutely has a place in this economy. I mean, think for a minute electrification for farm machinery, construction equipment, when it's out in the field and there's no place to plug it in to charge it. I mean, harvesting grains in the Midwest where these machines are in the field for weeks on end, running 24 hours a day. That's where hydrogen has a place. Heavy rail.
And not to mention crop drought, which is...
Absolutely.
I can't wait to see an electric crop dryer. That'll be a sight to see.
It's not going to happen.
We have electric forklifts in our company, right? So they're beautiful, they're clean, they're quiet, they're safe, all of that. However, you cannot run them 24/7. So that's for my personal point of view, hydrogen is very interesting because hydrogen, you tank it up 50 minutes later, you're back up and running. So you have a $60,000 piece of equipment that can run 24/7 versus doubling up on the CapEx to have the capacity to fulfill the operations that we need.
It's also a phenomenal alternate to batteries for storage. As you were talking earlier, if you make hydrogen storage to solar generation, it's phenomenal. And batteries are dirty. I'm sorry, but they are.
Well, from the mining aspect, definitely.
Yes.
I think part of the pushback that we're seeing is a resistance to combustion of any sort. And my concern with that is combustion itself is not the problem. The problem is desequestering carbon that's been underground for hundreds of millions of years. But if that carbon molecule that you're burning comes from part of the natural carbon cycle, it was a plant less than a year ago, and that's a whole different story.
I would just add on the point of hydrogen, New York and other northeastern states have put forward a proposal for one of the hydrogen hubs. So I think while there is some opposition for sure, as there is to everything, right? If you've heard NIMBY, I don't know if you've heard NOPE, it's like not on planet Earth. It's like about what we're willing to build. So there's some of that. But I think there is acknowledgement that we need another resource and we need to move that technology forward. We need to invest in it. So I think it's not across the board. It's maybe not a silver bullet for the next few years, but I think the state does acknowledge that. And I know this administration is actively involved in that, so there's hope.
There's another question?
I was just going to say, one of the challenges with hydrogen is the amount of energy it takes to create it. So we have a grid, it's limited. If we're using all of the megawatts to create the hydrogen, there's not enough for nonprofits to run their business, to even rent their house. So that's one of the challenges.
Yeah, and I think that's why if you read National Grid's proposal for their fossil-free vision, their thought about making, and I don't want to speak out of turn, so Amanda, jump in if I get this wrong, but their utilities are thinking about how do you take, when you have excess wind and solar, because of course there is times like the gentleman said over there at his own home, and create the hydrogen at that point. And that's kind of like a way to use it for storage. But yes, it's very energy intensive, and that's why you see those different colors, right? You could make it with natural gas, you could make it with wind and solar. It is expensive and it does use a lot of energy, so we need it all.
and I think that is probably what a lot of folks want to do is see hydrogen used as storage, right? Because when wind farms come on, they're blowing 100%, sometimes they have to be curtailed. Instead of curtailing them, let them produce the hydrogen, which can then be used later down the road when, the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. But you are right, it is expensive to produce initially. Any other questions?
Mark. My own experience testifying in public hearings in front of the Climate Action Council, lest anyone think that it was the council itself proposing the conversation about hydrogen. In my experience, it was the audience. This is my way of thinking that it was the council itself. It was just 300 people in the audience groaning when we talk about anything about electric.
Well, because that would keep, it necessitates the need for pipelines too, right? Hydrogen.
Sorry?
If you have hydrogen, it necessitates the need for pipelines, right?
We're leveraging the existing pipelines.
Right. Exactly.
And I promise to shut up after this. But there's a couple things I didn't want to leave without saying. First of all, we've been talking kind of at the state level here now, but there is a push primarily through NYSERDA and their stretch building codes to reach down into municipalities to preempt this and have municipalities adopt business codes that prohibit fossil fuels in new residential commercial construction, along with other insulation mandates and things like that. So that's going on at the same time. As far as housing, to your point on housing, and just an anecdote on how the market gets distorted. Yesterday, I had a builder call me who has a customer that wants to build a house, and they want it to be total propane while they still can. So you could very well see people preemptively, jumping the gun here and putting in what they prefer to heat with. The other thing is, and finally, everything in business is cost benefit. And say in the perfect world, in New York, we figure a way out to hit every one of these carbon goals right on the number. Well, New York's carbon output, I think, is 0.04% of the global carbon production. And China is bringing on a couple odd hundred coal plants next year. India, half the people in India don't have electricity. They can't afford to put in wind and solar. They're going to put in coal, and Africa's going to put in coal, and these people desperately want electricity. My point is, if we want to solve the climate change problems and lower carbon, we need to be addressing the third world in a meaningful way. Because we're just kind of, we're a clean operation as it is, and it's really not going to affect anything meaningfully.
And as I said, we've reduced emissions, I think, more than any other country as a percentage over the last, between 2005 and 2019. So. That's it.
Thank you.